It's quite an honor to be awarded a book prize or award by an institution, the Abraham Lincoln Institute, consisting of fellow scholars, and it's always good to be here. Don is, I think Michael mentioned, is Secretary of Treasury of our organization, and he is one of the founders. He probably did not realize at the time how successful this organization, this institute, would become. But it is a national organization, and it has, under such excellent leadership as John Sellers, Michael Burlingame, and I could go on. I don't want to leave out anybody, but still, we've had excellent Fred Martin and Bob Melton and others. So Clark also. So I haven't left out too many, I don't think. But I have limited time for this paper, but so I will just go on and get on it. This paper is an offshoot of a book that will is scheduled for publication in October in the Concise Lincoln Library. Michael has provided a book in that, and there are others as well that are coming out with and have with very good books. They're short books. Mine, I think, will be about 170 pages, so it will not be up for any awards, I assure you. But it's something that I wanted to do, and this paper, as I said, is an offshoot of that. We have often neglected the important contribution that the Union governors have made in winning the Civil War and freeing the slaves. We too frequently are caught up in Lincoln's relationship with Congress and his military commanders to the exclusion of the Union governors. From the beginning, Lincoln recognized the need to secure the cooperation of the state executives in the war. He knew that he must respect the governor's constitutional authority under the traditional federal system of government, unless it became necessary to prevent the obstruction of the war effort. Lincoln also realized that the governors were important in shaping public opinion in their states and regions. The northern governors, except the free state governors in the north, except for Democrats Horatio Seymour of New York and Joel Parker of New Jersey, both elected in 1862, belonged to Lincoln's Union or Republican coalition and supported his war policies. Seymour and Parker, despite their opposition to Lincoln's policies, remained true to the fundamental Union purposes in the war, that is, the suppression of the Southern Rebellion. The border slave state governors, although they did not affiliate with Lincoln's party, remained loyal, except for Claiborne Jackson of Missouri, who fled to the Confederacy early in the war. Several of the border state governors have been members of Lincoln's old party, the Whig Party, or its offshoot, the Know Nothing Party, which made it easier for them to cooperate with the president in preserving the Union, but not in his anti-slavery policies and federal military intervention in their states. Lincoln, then and later, has been accused of seeking to reduce the power of the states and governors during the war. His purpose, critics have charged, was nothing less than the creation of a strong or consolidated government in Washington in order to bring about what they perceived as the national political and economic doctrine of Lincoln's old Whig Party. In an influential essay a number of years ago, Edmund Wilson, a popular American man of letters, compared Lincoln to Bismarck and Lenin as ruthless creators of national unity. Historian Morton Keller has rightly said that this view ignores the context of cultural and institutional restraints in which mid-19th century American presidents worked. Keller could have added, that the political context also inhibited the president's actions had he wanted to expand his authority beyond the needs to suppress the rebellion. At any rate, Lincoln did not conceive of the establishment of a consolidated government, federal government, at the expense of the state authority. He understood that the war was a people's war, requiring the active support of state and local authorities. Neither Lincoln nor the governors in their relationship with each other and in their management of affairs were free of mistakes and differences. The demands and problems of fighting a war to save the Union and maintaining political support in the loyal states were immense. The governors did not hold Lincoln in awe as future generations would do. At the same time, most governors, though often critical of his actions or inactions, developed a certain respect for him and his constitutional authority to suppress the rebellion. Conflict between Washington and the state capitals, however, was inevitable. To the credit of the president and the governors, the disagreements never reached a point that appreciably hindered the war effort. The governors frequently complained to Lincoln about the inertia of his administration in prosecuting the war and about the incompetence of the generals like McClellan and Buell. They usually cooperated with him even on controversial issues like military conscription and emancipation, issues that bitterly divided the people of their states. The governors were often ahead of Lincoln in raising troops, providing for their needs and those of their families, and suppressing so-called traitors at home. Richard Yates of Lincoln's home state, Oliver P. Morton of Indiana, David Todd of Ohio, Samuel J. Kirkwood of Iowa, Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania, Edwin D. Morgan of New York, who was Seymour's predecessor, and John A. Andrew of Massachusetts were virtually war ministers in 1861, 1862. During the course of the Civil War, 59 men served as governors of the 25 Union states. These included the governors of the Northern Free States, West Virginia, which was admitted to statehood in 1863, the Far West governors of Colorado, of Oregon and California, and Nevada, the latter admitted in 1864, and the Union slave states governors of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Only Morton, Curtin, Andrew, and William A. Buckingham of Connecticut served from the beginning of the war to its end. The governors also reflected different regional interests. The northeastern governors were keenly attuned to the commercial, banking, and industrial interests of the East. Their counterparts in the West, today's Midwest, dutifully represented their section's agricultural interest and dependence on the Mississippi-Ohio River system for the region's markets. The governors of the semi-frontier states of Minnesota, Iowa, Kansas, and Wisconsin, while vigorously supporting the war, were deeply concerned about Indian conflict, federal land policy, and railroad development. The governors of the new state of Kansas also faced a bitter conflict with new state of Kansas also faced a bitter struggle with pro-slavery elements in Missouri. The northern governors during the first part of the war acknowledged that slavery was wrong, but they held different views on what should or could be done about it. However, they agreed with Lincoln and the Republican platform that slavery should not be permitted to expand into the Western territories. While believing that slavery was a cause of the war, lower North governors often denounced the abolitionists as well as the Southern fire eaters for the sectional division. The border slave state governors, on the other hand, placed blame for the conflict squarely on the anti-slavery agitators and the so-called Black Republicans of the North. At the same time, upper North governors held Southern rights extremists and their Northern Democratic allies solely responsible for causing secession and war. The upper North governors opposed the enforcement of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 for the return of escaping slaves to their masters. The New England governors and Austin Blair of Michigan, a native of upstate New York, were more ardent opponents of slavery and Southern society than their lower North colleagues. Still, In the beginning of the war, these governors largely muted their strong anti-slavery and anti-Southern opinions in order to secure a united North behind the war. They also did not want to provoke the border states into secession by raising the specter of abolition in the South. The Upper North governors stood behind Lincoln's announced purpose to preserve the Union and its Republican institutions and not interfere with Southern property rights. Governor Andrew of Massachusetts, a staunch opponent of slavery, in 1861 told his state legislators that this is no war of sections, no war of North or South. It is the struggle of the people to vindicate their own rights, to retain and invigorate the institutions of their fathers. Yet, Andrew admitted, I do not forget that subtle poison, he meant slavery, which has lurked always in our national system. By the end of 1861, Andrew, the leader of the New England governors, had rejected Lincoln's conservative policy towards slavery. He then joined Emancipation to the primary national Union purpose in the war. The lower North and Western states generally supported Lincoln's position on slavery. Their views, however, became more anti-slavery as the war became hard. In January 1862, Governor Samuel J. Kirkwood of Iowa told his state legislature, "The war is waged by our government for the preservation of the Union and not for the extinction of slavery, unless the preservation of the one shall require the extinction of the other." Kirkwood was probably several months ahead of Lincoln in concluding that saving the Union would require emancipation. Only a few governors had met Lincoln before he traveled to Washington in February to assume office. One was Kirkwood, who came to Springfield and had to be introduced to the president-elect. Another was Governor Andrew, who visited Lincoln after his nomination for president. Returning to Boston, Andrew waxed effusive in his praise for Lincoln. He told a Republican audience in Boston that in listening to the candidate, my eyes were never lifted with the vision of a human face in which more transparent honesty and more benighted kindness were combined with more of the intellect and firmness which belong to masculine humanity. During the war, however, Andrew found Lincoln sadly wanting in the essential qualities of leadership, namely firmness and a compelling commitment to the anti-slavery cause. The governors mobilized their people for the war in 1861 after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for troops, though the border state governors proved hesitant in providing men to invade the South. During periods of gloom for the Union cause in 1862 and 1864, the governors contributed greatly to bolstering homefront morale. Throughout the war, they played a major role in fulfilling Lincoln's growing need for troops, even after national military conscription was adopted in 1863. The Republican governors especially kept the president informed about political conditions in their states and region, though, as in the case of Governor Morton of Indiana, they tended to exaggerate the strength and purposes of the Democratic opposition, as Mark Neely has talked about the peace movement here. Republicans routinely referred to Democrats as copperheads and traitors, a characterization that Lincoln at times agreed with despite his tolerance for loyal political dissent. At no time did the governors prove more important in providing Lincoln with the backing that he needed than when they met at Altoona, Pennsylvania on September the 24th, 1862. The conference of about one-half of the governors occurred at a critical time in the war and only 2 days after Lincoln issued his controversial preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Despite the conference's significance, there is no modern study of it that I know of. William Best Hesseltine's chapter on the Altoona meeting in his 1948 book on the Northern governors during the Civil War remains the standard account of the conference. It's been reissued too since then. Hesseltine concluded that Lincoln controlled the meeting of the governors. This historian wrote that the President, by issuing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation 2 days before the meeting, cleverly prevented the success of the radical wing of his party. In the end, Heseltine contended Lincoln had gained the complete direction of the war effort. The governors, this historian maintained, had thereby lost the power to control their states. They could neither deliver men to the armies nor voters to the polls. Civil War historians, if they mention the Altoona Conference at all, have followed Heseltine's interpretation of it. I believe that Heseltine is mistaken in his account of the Altoona Conference and its importance. The long-held view, first argued by Heseltine, that the President used the conference to control affairs is incorrect, I believe. Indeed, Lincoln later remarked to Congressman George Boutwell of Massachusetts, "I never thought of the meeting of the governors at Altoona, and I can hardly remember that I knew anything about it at the time." Let's examine what actually happened at Altoona. On September 14, 1862, Governor Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania had sent a telegram to the governors inviting them to Altoona on the 24th of that month. When Curtin issued the call, the war was going badly for the Union. Generals McClellan and Pope had been repulsed by General Lee in Virginia, and Lee's army had invaded Maryland. Two Confederate armies also were on the march in Kentucky, and smaller operations were underway in Missouri and elsewhere. With the approach of important fall elections, Curtin and his fellow Union governors were intensely troubled about the course of the war and the rise of peace Democrats in the key states of the lower West, Pennsylvania and New York. Curtin, a middle-of-the-road Republican, wanted the governors to consult and adopt a strong statement about the war and strengthen the hand of the Lincoln government in the crisis. 11 of the governors accepted the invitation to attend the meeting in central Pennsylvania. Governor Morton of Indiana sent a representative. Most of the Trans-Mississippi River governors declined either because of serious problems at home, the distance involved in traveling to the east, or in the case of the three border state governors who believed that the conference was a radical conspiracy to force emancipation in all of the states. Augustus W. Bradford was the only border state governor to accept the invitation, though Francis H. Pierpont of the restored Union government of Virginia, mainly Western Virginia, attended the meeting. Governor Ramsey of Minnesota had his hands full in dealing with a major Dakota Sioux uprising at home and could not go to Altoona. Governor Edwin D. Morgan of New York pleaded that he was too busy raising troops to attend the conference. He may have had other reasons too, political reasons. When the governors met on September 24 at Altoona, they chose Bradford, a conservative Unionist, to chair the meeting. The Maryland governor's selection indicated that the fear of a New England-led radical plot to demand immediate emancipation, a reorganization of Lincoln's cabinet, and a change in the conduct of the war had been exaggerated. Still, Governor Andrew, the leader of the New England delegation, argued at Altoona for a stronger commitment to emancipation than contained in Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation issued 2 days earlier. In addition, the Massachusetts governor sought the governor's endorsement for black recruitment in the Army. He also wanted a reorganization of the cabinet and the replacement of General McClellan with John C. Fremont, an anti-slavery general. Bradford, David Todd of Ohio, and Curtin of Pennsylvania defended McClellan on the grounds that the little Napoleon had saved Maryland and Pennsylvania from Lee's powerful army. The governors must have been amused by Andrew's suggestion that Fremont, a failed general, would be a good choice to replace McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Andrew received little support for his radical recommendations, which, if adopted by the governors, would surely have been divisive and defeated the purpose of the conference to rally the people behind the war. In the end, Andrew acquiesced in the majority's relatively conservative recommendations to Lincoln. Partly to placate Andrew, the governors assigned him the task of drafting an address to the president that expressed the views of the governors. In their address to Lincoln, the governors, except for Bradford, hailed with heartfelt gratitude the president's proclamation declaring slaves emancipated from their bondage in the rebel states. They avoided the inflammatory issue of slavery in the border states, blacks in the Army, and the status of former slaves in freedom. The governors, like Lincoln, hoped that the final Emancipation Proclamation would mark the beginning of the end of slavery in America and would speedily and triumphant result in triumphant victories over our enemies. They predicted that the decision of the president to strike at the root of the rebellion, that is slavery, will lend new vigor to the Union efforts and new life and hopes to the hearts of the people. The governors in their Altoona address promised, as they announced, to surround the president with our constant support in this war for the preservation of the national life and the hope of humanity. They pledged to carry out the lawful acts of the president, cooperating always in our spheres with the federal government, and provide the most vigorous exercise of all of our lawful and proper powers to suppress the rebellion. They included support for martial law where necessary, which had the effect of reinforcing Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus on the day of the Altoona conference. They also asked Lincoln to call for a reserve of 100,000 volunteers for 1 year's service, the requisition for each state to be raised after it had filled its quota with volunteers and militia troops. These reserves, they said, should be constantly kept on foot, to be raised, armed, equipped, and trained at home and ready for emergencies when needed, eventualities that the lower North governors expected with the rise of the Copperheads in their states. Lincoln, however, did not issue a call for reserves at this time. At the end of the one-day conference, the governors went to Washington to deliver their address to the president and, not incidentally, make known privately some of their concerns that they believed should not be raised at the conference raised in writing. After Governor Andrew read the document to the president, Lincoln made a very short and pleasant reply to the address, as Governor Austin Blair of Michigan later wrote. The president thanked the governors for all they had done to help the general government in this great crisis. He told them that no fact had assured him so thoroughly of the justice of the Emancipation Proclamation than the hearty approbation of the governors to his action. He believed that he would carry out most, if not all, of their suggestions made in their address, and he saw no need to write a formal response to the document. A general discussion of the war followed Lincoln's brief statement to the governors. The talks turned to General McClellan's performance as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Several governors criticized the general, with Kirkwood of Iowa the most outspoken. A rugged, plain-dressed farmer, Kirkwood rose from his seat and in frank language addressed the president. Writing years after the meeting, he vividly recalled his telling Lincoln that he spoke for the people of Iowa when he said that McClellan had demonstrated his incapacity for command. The governor argued that though the Western armies had won most of the Union victories in the war, McClellan's army, which was better and stronger armed, better clothed, better equipped in every way, had not succeeded. Our Western troops, Kirkwood told Lincoln, were always doing something, and McClellan was only getting ready to fight, despite the bravery of the Eastern troops. At this point, Lincoln quipped, "You Iowa people then judge generals as you do lawyers by their success in trying cases." Not to be outdone, Kirkwood shot back, "Yes, something like that. The lawyer who is always losing his cases, especially when he was right and had justice on his side, don't get much practice in Iowa." After further comment, Kirkwood bluntly declared, "Mr. President, our Iowa people fear, and I fear, that the administration is afraid to remove General McClellan from command. Color came to Lincoln's face. Kirkwood quickly explained, Iowans believe that McClellan and his toadies in the Army, along with certain class of politicians outside the Army, had made successful efforts to attach his soldiers to him personally. They have caused his soldiers to believe that the severe criticism to which the general has been subject was intended to apply to them and as well as to him. The minds of the soldiers, Kirkwood claimed, have so biased them in favor of McClellan as to make it unsafe to remove him for fear his removal might cause insubordination, perhaps mutiny. That is what I meant when I spoke of your being afraid to remove him. The president remained silent for a moment, and then he said slowly and with great emphasis, Kirkwood, if I believed our cause would be benefited by removing General McClellan tomorrow, I would remove him tomorrow and not till then. Lincoln then carefully announced to the governors, after having said so much in favor of General McClellan, I don't want you to think that I do not know his deficiencies. He is overcautious and lacking in confidence in himself and his ability to win victories with the forces in his command. He fights a battle about as well as any of them when he does fight. But when a substantial victory is won, Lincoln clearly had in mind Antietam, he seems incapable of properly following it up as to reap the fruits of it, and does not seem to do us any good. But if I remove him, someone must take his place. Who shall it be? Governor Blair interjected, why not try another man, Mr. President? Whereupon Lincoln replied, but I might lose the Army by that, which suggested that he was also concerned about the reaction of McClellan's troops and supporters outside of the Army if he removed the general, which partly somewhat contradicts what he had said just earlier. After the address of the governors was printed, Lincoln sent it out to all of them to sign for their endorsement. All signed the document except for the 4 border state governors, Charles Olden of New Jersey and Governor Morgan of New York. Morgan weakly explained that he could not approve the proceedings of a meeting at which he was not present. The border state governors and Olden disapproved mainly because of the address's endorsement of emancipation. Republican newspapers and some Democratic sheets praised the address and predicted that the work of the Altoona Conference would strengthen support for the war. Coming at a dark time in the war when Union morale had reached a low point, the governors at Altoona provided a needed boost to public support for the military effort against the rebellion, though its approval of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and his suspension of the writ of habeas corpus hurt the Republicans in the fall campaign. Governor Blair of Michigan later wrote that the governor's address promoted enlistments in the states and infused greater activity into the recruiting service, thereby strengthening the armies in the field. Still, the Democrats achieved important successes in the 1862 election. In New York, Horatio Seymour won a shocking victory in the gubernatorial contest. Although he proved a thorn in Lincoln's side on emancipation and constitutional rights, Seymour remained true to the Union and the war effort. Seymour's image, however, was tarnished by the distortion and abuse hurled his way by Horace Greeley and the New York Republican press, especially for his actions during the draft riots in the city after the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. Greeley and Republicans routinely referred to the governor as a copperhead. Nonetheless, before the rioting, Seymour had dispatched New York troops to help save Pennsylvania from Lee's army. Later, in November, Seymour joined other governors in the ceremony dedicating the cemetery at Gettysburg. He was on the platform when Lincoln delivered his memorable address. After the ceremony, Seymour gave a strong patriotic speech to New York troops and others who had journeyed to Gettysburg for the dedication. The triumph of John Brown of Ohio and incumbent Andrew Curtin in Pennsylvania, both Lincoln supporters, in the 1863 gubernatorial elections, reversed the Democratic and peace movement's successes in the critical lower north. Of course, Gettysburg and Vicksburg had a great deal to do with the Republican successes in that election. The war, however, became a stalemate in the summer of 1864, which threatened the Republican or the Union Party's control in the forthcoming elections. The governors again aided the Union cause against the Democrats, who had adopted a war failure and peace platform. They first helped to beat back an effort to replace Lincoln as the Union Party's standard bearer, though Governor Andrew of Massachusetts at first supported the Eastern Republican movement to select another candidate for president. Then, during the campaign, several of them, notably Brow in Ohio and Morton in Indiana, took to the stump for Lincoln and the Union Party. Governor Seymour supported McClellan as the most likely candidate to bring peace and restore the Union and without damage to constitutional rights. The election of 1864 willed that slavery would soon end everywhere in the United States. When Lincoln sent the 13th Amendment out of the state for ratification, the governors, including New York, which now had a Republican governor, lobbied the legislatures for the Freedom Amendment's immediate approval. Only Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey failed to honor the wishes of Lincoln and the governors to ratify the amendment. General Lee's surrender at Appomattox on April 9, 1865, and the impending capitulation of all rebel armies sparked wild celebrations in the Union states. But a few days later, the celebrations turned to shock and profound sorrow with the tragic news of the president's assassination. Many political leaders who had questioned Lincoln's abilities now praised his leadership in the war. No one underwent a greater conversion on the proverbial road to Damascus than Governor Andrew, who earlier had characterized Lincoln as lacking in the essential qualities of leadership. In officially reporting the president's death to the Massachusetts legislature, Andrew expounded on Lincoln's remarkable qualities and his contribution to American history. Lincoln, the radical Republican governor, wrote, had the rare gift of discerning and setting aside whatever is extraneous and incidental, and of simplifying an inquiry or an argument by just discriminations. The purpose of his mind, Andrew declared, waited for the instruction of his deliberate judgment, and he was never ashamed to hesitate until he was sure that he was intellectually informed. Andrew further declared that Lincoln, though not greatly gifted in what is called the intuition of reason, was nevertheless of so honest an intellect that by the processes of methodical reasoning, he was often led so directly to his result that he occasionally seemed to rise into that particular sphere which we assign to those who are natural. Andrew asserted that it would be challenging human history to produce the name of a ruler more just, unselfish, or unresentful than Abraham Lincoln. At the same time, he said that it would be premature for us to assert how far Lincoln led the American people. The unfolding of events in the history we are yet to enact will alone determine the limits of such influence. It is enough for his immortal glory that he faithfully represented the people, their confidence in democratic government, their constancy in the hour of adversity, and their magnanimity in the hour of triumph. Finally, Andrew declared, Lincoln proclaimed liberty to 3 million of American slaves and prepared the way for universal emancipation. The other governors, who also had contributed to the preservation of the Union and its founding principles, probably did not read Andrew's inspiring review of the martyred president's qualities and place in history. If they had, they would have agreed with the Massachusetts governor's assessment of Abraham Lincoln. Thank you. We probably have time for questions. I will try to respond. Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question about, you mentioned Governor Seymour resisting the idea of conscription. Were there any other governors who felt, uneasy about that idea as well? And then the other question was, what was the role of the northern governors in terms of selecting commanding generals in the Union Army? Because there were so many political generals in the Union Army.
Yeah.
The governors obviously played a role.
In many cases, they had a role in selecting the brigadier generals, but that was a federal authority came to bear there. Lincoln would, for political reasons, would follow along. But it went a little bit too far when Governor Yates of Illinois wanted to be a major general. But then he selected John A. McClernand, not McClellan, from Illinois as a major general. And he was a fairly able general, but came into conflict with Grant. But they did form the regiments and select the colonels and so on and send them to the Union Army. But they still took a hand. For example, Governor Morton just routinely visited the Indiana troops in the field, and General Sherman, who commanded the troops around Shiloh after that battle, he was commanded some of them. He thought Morton did some good things in terms of morale and so on after that, the first really brutal battle in the Civil War, horrendous battle in the Civil War. So they did, and in some cases they complained to Lincoln, the governors did, about not selecting certain men. And they put pressure on him to remove Buell, and I think that was part of the reason that he was finally removed. I go in this a little bit more in the book. What was the other question?
Oh, the other was about, you mentioned Governor Seymour in terms of resisting conscription.
Yeah.
In other words, compulsory service.
Yeah.
Did the other governors, were there any other governors who felt like Seymour?
Well, Governor Joel Parker, who was a Democrat of New Jersey, did so. And he, of course, New Jersey was heavily Democratic. And so, in fact, it was vehemently opposed to the Emancipation Proclamation as well. In terms of the governors elsewhere, even some of the Republican governors did not like the business that you could buy your way out of the conscription. And the Border State governors also did not like conscription. They thought that was a state function, and this was a violation of the traditions of the American system and the Constitution, for that matter. Seymour wanted to get that before the judges, before the courts. And Lincoln actually, this is not generally known, I don't think, but Lincoln actually finally told Seymour that we just can't wait for the courts to act on this. We've got to have troops, and he was right on that. But at some point, I would be agreeable for the courts deciding on the matter, the constitutional issue of conscription. Lincoln was a little leery about that, but some of the governors understood the political situation at home regarding conscription, and they were terribly concerned too, and expressed their concerns to Lincoln, but they didn't go public in opposing this policy.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned Governor Kirkwood, and I just had two questions about him that kind of intrigued me. One is that was he able to meet his quotas initially in the war?
Kirkwood?
Yeah, and Kirkwood. And also, what role did he have in creating what I understood were the Iowa Greyhounds, or the federal troops that had gray uniforms?
I'm not sure about the latter part of that, but the first part is Kirkwood and other Iowa leaders, Republican leaders, said they had met their quotas, and therefore no troops should be drafted. And as far as I know, they were not. Somebody else might know about a little bit more about Iowa. But they needed troops at home because there was a fear of Indians on the northwestern border as a result of the Dakota Sioux uprising in Minnesota. And that spilled over to Wisconsin as the concern, the fear and all as well. And Governor Ramsey of Minnesota sent Lincoln a pretty sharp telegram saying, send the Minnesota cavalry unit home because we need the cavalry here to suppress the Indian uprising. So that was a concern. The governors had other concerns. Of course, the border state governors were concerned about black recruitment, very much so, to the point where Governor of Kentucky almost said he would use force to prevent black recruitment in Kentucky, and so Lincoln suspended that for a time. And when he came back, the time was a little bit better to succeed in that state as well. Yes, sir.
Yes, since we're in Maryland, would you explain to the audience why Governor Bradford of Maryland probably faced the personally most tragic situation of all the governors, but he still managed to surmount it? Tell everybody about his son who served with the Confederates and also what happened to his mansion.
Truth is, I did not know his son served with the Confederates.
Oh,
That's good.
His mansion, which is on the Baltimore County line.
You mean Bradford? I thought you said Brow. Right, I'm sorry. Yeah, Bradford's son was a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Army. But Bradford was ready to have some Confederates or secessionists and rebels, or whatever they wanted to call them, traitors, shot. But they were not usually in Maryland, and his mansion was burned. That's true. And when the troops swept around Baltimore, it's my understanding, down to try to rescue trying to get to the Cape Lookout, the camp down there, and get the Confederate prisoners there that would go back to the Army. But that failed, as you know. But it sent shockwaves through Baltimore and other places. In fact, the general who led that sweep around Baltimore was a Maryland.
Bradley Johnson.
Troops. Yeah. Oh, right. Well, he was under the command of, was it Johnson? Yes. Yeah, Johnson. Gilmer was the colonel under his command. That created shockwaves for sure in Maryland. But Bradford, he eventually came around on emancipation, but not in 1862 and early 63. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had an impact on the attitudes of these conservative unions in these states, in the border states. Yes, sir.
On the issue of conscription, wasn't it Justice Woodward of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, who ran for governor in 1863, who issued an opinion declaring conscription unconstitutional?
Yes, I think so. Weren't there three members of that Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, Mark? I think there were three members, right? And but Woodward was one of them, and I don't think he was on the court by the time of this really became a burning issue. I could be mistaken on that, but it was certainly the business of commutation of service under conscription was a burning issue, and even the Republican governors did not like it, but they sort of muted their public criticism of it. It fed into the civil liberties platform of the Democrats. Yes, sir.
For a state like Illinois, with Yates having a Democratic legislature, how difficult was it for Republican governors in those instances to carry out pro-war activities?
It was very difficult, especially in Indiana, because Martin pretty much fired from the hip here, and he refused to cooperate, and perhaps rightly so. And so finally he didn't get money from the legislature to do much, and so he had to go to private supporters and to banks and to Stanton, in fact, who had a reserve fund for such things to continue the government in Indiana. And there you get the peace forces, you get those civil rights forces that involved in the Democratic Party, and Horatio Seymour was their hero, even those who the really small minority who were peace people in the Democratic Party in Indiana. They looked to Seymour, Horatio Seymour, that is their standard bearer, and they passed a resolution in support of Seymour. Then what was the other part of that?
That was really the question, did Yates have problems?
Oh yeah, Yates. Well, Yates handling it with a bit of more finesse, actually. He gave the legislature somewhat what they wanted, but not everything. And so they went home to consult with the people, thinking that when they came back, they would be in good shape and could act the way the Indiana legislature had acted, but they were mistaken. They were mistaken by the time they came back. That's what Yates wanted. And so there was a threat, of course, but it didn't assume the level of that in Indiana. You really, in Wisconsin, get a problem in late 1862 when we don't think of Wisconsin as being a state with democratic strength, but it did. And I've forgotten the details on just what happened there, but the governor there, who was the only Jewish governor, I think, in American history. I'm sorry, during the Civil War, North or South, that was able to hold on to the situation. But he got into a clash. He got into a clash with Stanton over protecting the northern Wisconsin, the Indian frontier. But otherwise, things went okay. Okay. Is that it? Thank you.